The empty chair opposite Elias wasn't just furniture. It was a gravitational singularity. It pulled at the corners of his vision, swallowed the ambient light, and warped the air around his table until the rest of the world looked like it was viewed through the bottom of a glass bottle. It was a Tuesday in Seattle, a city that wore gray like a uniform, and the rain was doing its best to wash the pavement into the sound. Elias sat in the back corner booth of the Gilded Teapot, a shop that smelled aggressively of bergamot, wet wool, and the dust of unread books. It was a sanctuary for the lonely, the studious, and the broken. Elias fit comfortably into the third category. He was 42, though the Mirror lately insisted he was 50. He wore a cable-knit cardigan that was fraying at the cuffs a sweater his wife, Sarah, had bought him 3 Christmases ago. He wore it because it still held a faint, molecular memory of detergent and life, even if the man inside it felt like he was made of sawdust. Brenda, the waitress with the orthotic shoes and the kind, tired eyes, approached the table. She didn't ask what he wanted. She knew. She set the pot of Earl Grey down with a soft clatter, followed by a plate containing 2 scones. 1 blueberry, 1 plain, clotted cream, strawberry jam. "Extra hot water today, Elias," she said softly, her hand lingering for a fraction of a second on the edge of the table. It was a gesture of pity that used to make him bristle, but now he just accepted it like he accepted the rain. "Thanks, Brenda," he murmured. His voice was rusty, a hinge that hadn't been oiled in months. She walked away, leaving him to his ritual. It was exactly 2 years to the day. 2 years since the phone call. 2 years since the black ice on the highway. 2 years since the noise in his life, the laughter, the toy cars crashing into baseboards, the debates over dinner had been silenced with the violent finality of a guillotine blade. Elias poured the tea. He added milk and watched it cloud the dark liquid, swirling into beige fractals. He buttered the plain scone for himself. He buttered the blueberry scone for the empty chair. He didn't eat. He just sat there, guarding the perimeter of his grief. He looked at the second scone. It was for his son Leo, who would have been 6 now. Leo, who had loved blueberries so much his tongue was perpetually stained purple. The scone sat there, a silent offering to a ghost who couldn't eat it. The shop was quiet. The low hum of a radiator, the turning of a page from the student 3 tables away, the hiss of the espresso machine. It was a controlled environment. Elias liked it controlled. He had built a fortress of solitude so high that nothing could get in to hurt him again. And then the bell above the door chimed. It wasn't the polite tinkle that announced a regular. It was a jagged, frantic sound, the door thrown open with too much force and caught just before it slammed. The atmosphere in the shop shifted instantly. The air pressure dropped. Elias didn't look up immediately. He rarely did, but he felt the disturbance. It was low to the ground. Small, fast-moving energy. He lifted his eyes over the rim of his teacup. Standing in the entryway, dripping water onto the hardwood floor, were 3 girls. They were triplets, identical in a way that felt almost supernatural. They couldn't have been more than 6 or 7 years old. They were dressed in matching yellow raincoats that were so bright they hurt Ilias's eyes, like looking directly into a distress flare. They were vibrating, that was the only word for it. They stood in a tight phalanx, their chests heaving, their eyes wide and white-rimmed with panic. They weren't looking at the pastries. They were looking at the door they had just come through, then scanning the room with the desperate intensity of trapped animals looking for a burrow. One of them, the one in the middle, locked eyes with Elias. For a second, time suspended. Elias saw terror in those eyes, a raw, unfiltered fear that he recognized intimately. It was the same fear he saw in the mirror every morning at 3 a.m. Before he could process what was happening, the phalanx broke. They moved with a terrifying synchronization. They didn't run. They scurried low and fast, weaving between the tables. "Excuse me," the student whispered as they brushed past, but the girls ignored him. They were heading straight for the back corner. Straight for Elias. His heart gave a painful thud against his ribs. No, he thought. Not here. Not my table. This was his shrine. This was his memorial ground. But they didn't care about his sacred geometry. The invasion was swift and total. 2 of the girls slid into the booth on the opposite side, the leather squeaking under their wet coats. They physically shoved the empty chair, Leo's chair, the ghost chair, out of the way, jamming it against the wall to make room. The third girl, the one who had made eye contact, didn't sit opposite him. She slid into the booth right next to him. She pressed herself against his side, her wet raincoat soaking instantly into his dry wool cardigan. The shock of the cold water made Elias gasp. He froze, his spoon clinking sharply against the china saucer. He was holding the cup halfway to his mouth, paralyzed by the sudden proximity of other human beings. Elias started, his brain misfiring. The girl next to him reached out and gripped his forearm. Her hand was tiny, her fingers pale and freezing, but her grip was iron. It was the grip of someone dangling off a cliff edge. She looked up at him. Her hair was plastered to her forehead in wet ribbons. A single raindrop tracked down her nose. "Pretend you're our father," she whispered. The words were barely audible, a jagged shard of glass cutting through the silence of the tea shop. Elias blinked, certain he was hallucinating. "What? Please," she begged, her voice cracking. "Just for 10 minutes." "Pretend you're our dad? She's coming," one of the girls across the table hissed. This one had a small smudge of mud on her cheek. She grabbed the laminated menu and snapped it open, holding it up like a shield to cover her face. "Don't look at the door," the third girl whispered, the one next to the menu holder. She looked down at the table, her shoulders hunched up to her ears. Elias's pulse was hammering a frantic rhythm in his throat. This was too much, it was too loud, too wet, too close. His carefully curated isolation had been breached. His instinct was to stand up, to find Brenda, to call the police, to walk out into the rain and keep walking until he reached the ocean. "Who?" Elias whispered back. He didn't want to whisper. He wanted to shout. But the terror radiating off the girl next to him was contagious. It bypassed his logic and went straight to his lizard brain. "The hawk?" the girl next to him breathed. "The what?" "Eat," the girl commanded. She looked at the blueberry scone, Leo's scone. "She can't know we're not eating." Without waiting for permission, the girl reached out with a trembling hand, grabbed the blueberry scone, and took a massive, desperate bite. Crumbs fell onto the table. Elias watched, horrified and mesmerized, as the memorial pastry was demolished by a terrified child. Ding! The bell above the door chimed again. This time it wasn't frantic. It was deliberate. The atmosphere in the gilded teapot didn't just drop this time. It curdled. The air grew heavy and static. The triplets went rigid. The girl holding Elias's arm squeezed so hard he felt her fingernails through the wool. She stopped chewing the scone, her cheeks bulging like a chipmunk, eyes fixed on the tabletop. Elias slowly, involuntarily, lifted his eyes to the front of the shop. A woman stood on the welcome mat. She was tall, impeccably dressed in a severe gray trench coat that was belted tightly at the waist. She wore black leather gloves. Her hair was pulled back into a bun so tight it looked painful, pulling the skin at her temples taut. She held a black umbrella, which she shook out with a sharp snap, sending a spray of water onto the floor. She didn't look like a mother looking for lost children. She looked like a raptor scanning the brush for movement. She took a step forward. Clip, her heels were high, sharp stilettos that struck the hardwood floor with the authority of a gavel. Clip, clop. She turned her head slowly, panning from left to right. Her eyes were obscured by the distance, but Elias could feel the weight of her gaze. She was checking faces. She was checking the spaces under tables. "Is that her?" Elias murmured. The girl next to him buried her face in his sleeve. She was shaking so violently that Elias's own arm began to vibrate. "Don't let her take us," she sobbed into his cardigan. "Please, she locks us in the dark." The words hit Elias like a physical blow. "Locks us in the dark." A memory flashed in his mind. Leo, terrified of the closet, asking for the nightlight. The absolute, primal duty of a father to keep the darkness at bay. That machinery, rusted and buried under 2 years of silt, gave a groan. It wasn't fully online, but the pilot light had flickered on. The woman in gray was moving deeper into the shop. She dismissed the student with a glance. She ignored the couple by the window. She was moving toward the back, toward the booths, toward them. Elias looked at the 3 girls. They were small. They were defenseless, and they had chosen him. Out of everyone in the city, out of everyone in this shop, they had chosen his empty booth. They had filled the vacuum of his life with their chaotic, terrified presence. He looked at the empty chair where the menu girl was hiding. He looked at the half-eaten blueberry scone. The woman was 3 tables away. She stopped. She sniffed the air as if she could smell their fear. Then her gaze locked on the yellow raincoats. A slow, terrifying smile spread across her face. It wasn't a smile of relief. It was the smile of a hunter who had just cornered the fox. "There you are," the woman called out. Her voice was sweet, sickly sweet, like cough syrup that barely masked the taste of poison. "I've been looking everywhere for you silly geese," the girl next to Elias whimpered. The woman began to walk again, faster this time. Clip-clop-clip-clop. She was closing the distance. She was coming to claim them. Elias sat there, his heart thundering. He was just a man who drank tea and mourned. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't a father anymore. He was a hollow thing. But as the woman's shadow fell over their table, lengthening across the scones and the teapot, blocking out the light, Elias felt a sudden, hot spark of anger. It flared in his gut, burning through the numbness. This woman was bringing darkness to his table, and Elias was done with darkness. He took a breath, his lungs filling with the scent of wet wool and fear, and for the first time in 2 years, he decided to occupy the space he was in. He moved his hand. The shadow fell across the table like a physical stain, heavy, cold, and suffocating. It didn't just block the light. It seemed to absorb it, plunging the booth into a premature, artificial twilight. The air in the gilded teapot, which had previously smelled of steamed milk, Earl Grey, and the comforting musk of old paper, was suddenly colonized by a new, invasive scent. It was a sharp, chemical mixture of aggressive lavender, damp wool, and the distinct, metallic tang of ozone that clings to people who have walked through a storm without letting it touch them. Elias stared at the hand reaching for the girl next to him. It was a terrifying hand. The fingers were unnaturally long and skeletal, the skin pulled tight over knuckles that protruded like smooth white stones. They were tipped with manicured nails painted a milky, bloodless beige color that suggested a sterile, joyless precision. These hands didn't look like they were made for holding, comforting, or guiding. They looked like instruments designed for prying things open, for picking locks, and for pinching skin. They hovered inches from the yellow hood of the girl Sophie like a raptor's talons poising to snatch a field mouse from the safety of the tall grass. Sophie shrank against Elias. She didn't just lean. She tried to dissolve into him. She made a sound, a tiny, high-pitched whimper that vibrated through the wet wool of her raincoat and traveled straight into Elias's ribcage, bypassing his skin entirely. It was a sound of absolute, primal surrender. It was the sound of a small creature that knew, with biological certainty, that no matter how fast she ran, the monster was faster. That sound did it. It bypassed Elias's higher brain functions, the rational parts that told him he was a grieving widower, a man who wanted to be left alone, a man who was terrified of confrontation and had spent 2 years building a fortress of silence. It hot-wired a circuit that hadn't seen voltage in 730 days. It was the dormant machinery of fatherhood rusting in the dark, kicking violently back to life with a screech of grinding gears and the smell of burning dust. Elias moved. He didn't stand up. He didn't shout. He simply lifted his left hand, the one that was unpinned by Sophie's desperate grip, and placed his large, calloused palm firmly over the girl's shoulder. It was a heavy, claiming gesture, a barrier of flesh and bone, a declaration of territory. The woman's hand stopped in midair. Her fingers twitched, frustrated by the obstruction, hovering like a confused spider that had hit a glass wall. Elias slowly lifted his eyes. He didn't blink. He kept his face neutral, the mask of a bored, slightly irritated parent, though his heart was thrashing against his sternum like a bird trapped in a chimney. He felt a bead of sweat trickle down his spine, cold and sharp, tracing the line of his vertebrae. "Can I help you?" Elias asked. His voice surprised him. It wasn't the rusty whisper he used with Brenda the waitress or the silent internal monologue he used to speak to his dead wife. It was lower, resonant. It had a timbre of authority that scraped against the bottom of his throat. A voice he hadn't heard since he used to read The Hobbit aloud to a 4-year-old boy who demanded distinct voices for every dwarf. It was a voice that expected to be listened to. The woman in the gray trench coat blinked. Her eyes were pale blue, watery and sharp, framed by mascara that had begun to clump in the Seattle humidity. She looked at Elias, then at his heavy hand on the girl's shoulder, then back to his face. She hadn't expected the scenery to speak. She hadn't expected the prey to have a protector. She was used to compliance, to the silence of children and the absence of adults. She faltered, her sugary smile twitching at the corners, threatening to slide off her face entirely to reveal the sneer beneath. I am their guardian. For the afternoon. She straightened up, trying to regain her height advantage, looming over the seated man like a thunderhead. The rain dripped from the brim of her hat, landing on the table with soft plips. They wandered off from the group, she continued, her voice regaining some of its jagged edge. Naughty, silly things. We were at the museum, and I turned my back for 1 second. She reached out again, faster this time, changing targets. She aimed for the girl across the table, Chloe, who was still hiding behind the laminated menu, her knuckles white as she gripped the plastic. Come along now, girls, the woman cooed, her voice tight and high, the fake sweetness curdling in the air. The excursion is over. We have to get back before the traffic starts. You know how your father hates it when we are late? You wouldn't want to upset him, would you? The threat was veiled, but heavy. Your father hates it. We're not wandering, Elias said. He picked up his teacup with his free hand. The china rattled slightly against the saucer, a betrayal of his nerves that he hoped she wouldn't notice, but he brought it to his lips and took a slow, deliberate sip. The tea was lukewarm, bitter with tannins, but he forced himself to swallow, though his throat felt like it was lined with sandpaper. He set the cup down with a soft, deliberate clink. We're having tea, he continued, keeping his eyes locked on hers, refusing to let her look at the children. I picked them up early. The woman's hand hovered in the space between them, uncertain. The logic of the situation was crumbling for her. She looked at the matching yellow raincoats, then at Elias's fraying cardigan. She looked at the single pot of tea and the demolished scones. She was calculating. She was a predator, and predators are cautious when the wind changes direction. You picked them up? She repeated, her voice losing some of its syrup. She squinted at him, trying to place him. I wasn't informed of any pickup. The schedule is quite strict. Yes, Elias lied. The word felt dangerous, like holding a lit firecracker in his mouth. Administrative errors happen. Did my wife not call the agency? The woman froze. The mention of a spouse threw her off balance. Your wife? Sarah, Elias said. Saying the name felt like being punched in the solar plexus. Sarah. He hadn't spoken her name aloud to a stranger in 24 months. He usually hoarded it, kept it locked in the dark vault of his memory where nothing could tarnish it. But now, he was using it as a weapon. He was weaponizing his grief to build a shield for these children. He hoped Sarah, wherever she was, wouldn't mind being used as a fictional alibi. He imagined she would be proud. She had always hated bullies. Sarah called the school, Elias said, his voice gaining strength, fueled by the phantom pain of her name. I had a free afternoon. Meetings were canceled. We decided to celebrate. Celebrate what? The woman snapped. The veneer of politeness was cracking now, revealing the steel underneath. Her eyes darted around the table, counting the scones, noting the spilled milk, searching for a flaw in the tableau. There is no celebration on the schedule, sir. I have the schedule right here on my phone. There are no birthdays. No holidays. Elias looked down at Sophie. The girl was staring up at him, her eyes wide pools of terror and awe. He needed a detail. He needed a truth to anchor the lie, or this woman, this hawk would tear through his fabrication like tissue paper. He couldn't just say, we're celebrating life. He needed something concrete. Something a father would know. He saw the scrape on Sophie's knee, the mud smeared on the shin of her yellow raincoat. It was fresh mud. Sophie's soccer goal, Elias improvised. He looked back at the woman, locking eyes with her. First one of the season, a header, actually. We promised her scones if she made it. He squeezed Sophie's shoulder gently. Right, Soph? It was a gamble. A massive, reckless gamble. If the girl stayed silent, if she cried, if she said I don't play soccer, the game was up, the police would be called. Elias would be the creep in the tea shop trying to abduct someone else's children. But Sophie didn't cry. She swallowed hard, her little throat bobbing. She nodded, and then, with a courage that nearly broke Elias's heart, she spoke. It was a corner kick, Sophie said, her voice trembling but audible. And I put it in the top left. Elias felt a surge of pride so intense it made him dizzy. Top left. It was a detail only a kid who played would know. It was perfect. There you have it, Elias said, turning a cold smile on the woman. Top left, so, as you can see, they are safe. They are with their father. You can tell your supervisor, Mrs. Gable, was it? That Mr. Vance has them? He pulled names out of the ether. Mrs. Gable, Mr. Vance. He was spinning a reality out of thin air, weaving a safety net with nothing but words and sheer audacity. The woman, the hawk, wavered. She looked at the girls. They weren't looking at her. They were looking at Elias. They were leaning toward him, drawn into his gravity. The body language was undeniable. It was the unconscious magnetism of family, even if it was a family forged 10 seconds ago. People in the tea shop were watching now. The silence in the room had deepened. The student had lowered his book. Brenda was standing by the counter, a dishwell in her hand, watching the woman with narrowed, suspicious eyes. The ambient noise of the espresso machine seemed to have stopped. The audience was armed with silence, and they were on Elias's side. The hawk realized she was losing the optical battle. To snatch children from a booth where a man-a-father sat drinking tea would cause a scene. And women like her, predators who relied on silence and compliance, hated scenes. Scenes brought questions. Questions brought scrutiny. Scrutiny brought termination. I wasn't informed, she hissed, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper that only they could hear. She leaned in, invading Elias's personal space with the smell of wet dog and mints. There will be consequences for this lack of communication. Your husband, he will hear about this disruption. He does not pay me to be trifled with. Well, administrative errors happen, Elias said, leaning forward. His voice dropped too, matching hers, but his was lower, darker. But right now, you are interrupting our celebration. And you are scaring my daughter. Step back. The command hung in the air. Step back. It was the voice of a man who had stood at a graveside and screamed at the sky until his voice gave out. It was the voice of a man who had stared into the abyss for 2 years and found it boring compared to the threat standing in front of him. He had nothing left to lose and therefore nothing to fear from a woman in a raincoat. The woman bristled, her nostrils flared. She glared at the girls with a promise of retribution in her eyes, a look that said later, a look that promised darkness and pantries. Fine, she spat. But I will be calling the house to confirm immediately. You do that, Elias said, reaching for the teapot, dismissing her as if she were a servant. Check the voicemail. I'm sure Sarah left a message. The woman turned on her heel. The movement was sharp, violent. She marched toward the door, her heels striking the floor with angry staccato clicks, clack, clack, clack. Every step was an accusation. She shoved the door open, the bell jangling miserably, and disappeared into the gray curtain of rain. The door swung shut. The bell gave one last dying chime. For 3 seconds, nobody breathed. The shop held its collective breath. The vacuum left by the woman's departure was immense, sucking the tension out of the room but leaving a strange, vibrating silence in its wake. Then the girl across the table, Chloe, lowered the menu. Her face was pale, her freckles standing out like constellations against the white skin. She looked at the door, staring at the brass handle as if expecting it to turn again. Then, slowly, she looked at Elias. Is she gone? Chloe whispered. She's gone, Elias said. He let out a breath he felt he had been holding for 2 years. His adrenaline crashed, leaving his hands shaking violently. He set the teapot down before he dropped it. The silver rattled against the table, a chaotic sound in the sudden quiet. The girl next to him, Sophie, unlatched her fingers from his arm. She didn't pull away, though. She slumped against him, burying her face in the wet wool of his sleeve. Thank you, she muffled into his coat. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Who was that? Elias asked, his voice shaking. He felt lightheaded. Really, who was that? Miss Grench, the third girl said. This was Maya. She hadn't spoken during the encounter. She had been sitting frozen, staring at the blueberry scone as if it held the secrets of the universe. Now, she looked up. Her eyes were older than her face, watchful, cynical eyes that had seen too much for a 6-year-old. But we call her the Hawk, because she watches. She always watches. She said she was your guardian, Elias said. She's our nanny, Chloe said, her voice gaining volume now that the threat had receded. Dad hired her last month, after the last one quit. She came with references from a countess. She wears gloves inside the house. Why did you run? Elias asked. He needed to know. He needed to understand the shape of the danger he had just stepped in front of. Nannies are strict, but that was something else. She pinches, Sophie whispered, pulling away from his arm to show him. She rolled up the sleeve of her yellow raincoat, then the sleeve of the navy sweater underneath. Elias stared. On the tender skin of her upper arm there were bruises. Small, violet, pinch-shaped bruises. They were clusters of pain, strategically placed where long sleeves would hide them. They were the marks of cruelty that was designed to be invisible. A cold fury pooled in Elias's stomach. It wasn't the hot anger of the confrontation. It was a deep glacial rage. He wanted to run out into the rain and drag the woman back by her hair. He wanted to break something. She locks us in the pantry, Maya added quietly. She picked up the knife and began to butter the remains of the blueberry scone with surgical precision. If we make noise or if we don't finish our dinner. It's dark in there, and it smells like onions. There are spiders. She said if we told Dad, she'd send us to boarding school in Switzerland, Chloe said. She said Dad doesn't want us anyway, so he'd sign the papers without looking. Elias looked at them. 3 little girls, terrorized by a sadist in a gray coat, convinced that their own father viewed them as disposable luggage. Your dad, Elias said, treading carefully. Does he know? About the pantry? About the pinching? No, Sophie said. He's busy. He's sad, Chloe corrected. Mom died when we were babies. He works all the time so he doesn't have to think about it. That's why he hired the Hawk, so he doesn't have to look at us. The words cut Elias to the bone. So he doesn't have to look at us. He looked at the empty chair. He thought about how he had spent the last 2 years pushing the world away, hiding in this booth, staring at an empty seat so he wouldn't have to look at the reality of a world without his son. Was he any different from this Arthur Pendergast? Was his grief any more noble just because he didn't have children left to neglect? He's broken, Elias murmured, more to himself than to them. He's not broken, Maya said defensively. He's just far away, even when he's home. He looks right through us. Brenda appeared at the table. She held a tray with 3 mugs of hot chocolate, piled high with whipped cream, and a massive slice of lemon cake that wobbled as she set it down. She didn't ask if they ordered it. She just set it down. On the house, Brenda said softly. She looked at Elias. There was a new expression in her eyes. Not the usual pity, respect. You did good, Elias. You really did. She walked away before he could respond, giving them space. The arrival of the sugar changed the dynamic. The acute terror began to recede, replaced by the manic, jittery energy of an adrenaline crash. The girls descended on the food. It wasn't just hunger. It was a need for comfort, for sensory input that wasn't cold rain and fear. They ate the cake. They drank the hot chocolate, leaving foam mustaches on their upper lips. Maya finished the blueberry scone. Leo's scone and Elias found he didn't mind. In fact, watching the crumbs disappear into her mouth felt like a burden being lifted. The scone wasn't a memorial anymore. It was nourishment. You were really good, Chloe said, licking icing off her thumb. You sounded just like a dad, especially the part about the soccer. Yeah, Sophie agreed, leaning back against the booth leather, her legs swinging. How did you know about the header? I actually did score a header last week, Elias managed a weak smile. Lucky guess. Fathers know these things. Do you have kids? Maya asked. She was the observant one, the one who watched the details while the others talked. The table went quiet. The question hung there, suspended in the scent of lemon and chocolate. Elias looked at his hands. They were large, empty hands. Hands that hadn't held a child in 2 years. I did, he said, a boy. His name was Leo. Where is he? Sophie asked innocently. He died. Elias said. He didn't use euphemisms. He didn't say passed away or is sleeping. Those words were for people who wanted to pretend death wasn't final. 2 years ago today, in a car accident. With his mom, the girls stopped chewing. They looked at him with wide, solemn eyes. They didn't offer awkward platitudes like adults did. They didn't say, "I'm sorry for your loss," or "they're in a better place." They just understood. They were experts in loss. "That's why you were sad before," Sophie said softly. She reached out and touched his hand again. Her fingers were warm now, sticky with cake. "That's why you were sitting with the ghost chair." "The ghost chair?" "The empty one," she said, pointing to where Maya sat. "We saw you before we came in. You were talking to it in your head? You looked like our dad looks when he sits in Mom's garden." Elias nodded slowly. "Yes, I suppose I was. Our dad talks to Mom's picture sometimes," Chloe said. "When he thinks we're asleep, he cries. But if we come in, he stops and pretends he's working." Elias looked at these 3 mirrors of tragedy. They were caught in the crossfire of grief, just as he was. But they were fighting. They had run away. They had sought help. They were eating lemon cake in the face of disaster. They were braver than he had been in a long time. "You know," Elias said, sitting up straighter, "we can't just sit here forever. The hawk, Miss Grench, she's going to go back to your house. Or she's going to call your dad." "If she calls him, she'll lie," Maya said darkly. "She say we were bad." "She always does." "Then we need to tell him the truth first," Elias said. "We need to get ahead of the lie." "He won't answer," Chloe said, slumping. "He's in a board meeting?" "With a capital B, he never answers during a board meeting. Even if the house was on fire. He'll answer this," Elias said. He felt a clarity he hadn't felt in years. It was the clarity of purpose. For 2 years, his purpose had been to endure. Now his purpose was to fix this. To protect these 3 girls who had eaten his son's scone. To shake another father awake before it was too late. He pulled his phone from his pocket. The screen seemed bright in the dim shop. "Do you know the number?" Sophie nodded. She recited it. It was a rhythm she clearly knew by heart, a lifeline she had probably wanted to use 100 times before but never dared. Elias dialed. Ring. The sound was loud in the quiet booth. Ring. It sounded like an accusation. Ring. Click. "You have reached the voicemail of Arthur Pendergast. I am currently unavailable. Please leave a detailed message." Elias hung up. Voicemail. "Told you," Chloe muttered, stabbing a fork into the lemon rind. "He's in the boardroom. He's probably merging a company right now." "No," Elias said. He dialed again. "He won't." "He will," Elias said. He wasn't doing this as a stranger. He was doing this as a father calling another father out. He was calling from the brotherhood of the bereaved. Ring, ring, ring. Elias didn't hang up. He let it ring until it cycled through. He dialed a 3rd time immediately. His thumb hit the green button with force. On the 4th attempt, the ringing stopped abruptly. There was a shuffle, the sound of a heavy door closing, and then a voice. It was deep, harried, and vibrating with irritation. "I am in the middle of a merger discussion," the man barked. "This had better be a bloody emergency." Elias held the phone to his ear. He looked at Sophie, who was chewing her lip. He looked at Chloe, who was holding her breath. He looked at Maya, who was watching him with an intensity that demanded he not fail. "Mr. Pendergast," Elias said. "Who is this? How did you get this number?" "My name is Elias Vance," he said, keeping the fake last name. It felt like a shield, a superhero identity. "I am currently at the Gilded Teapot on 4th Street. I am sitting in a booth with your 3 daughters." The silence on the other end was absolute. The background noise of the office, the hum of voices, the click of typing seemed to vanish. "What?" Arthur's voice dropped an octave. It lost the irritation and gained a sharp edge of panic. "They are supposed to be with Miss Grench at the Science Center." "Miss Grench," Elias said, letting the name roll off his tongue like a curse, "is a woman who pinches children until they bruise. She is a woman who locks 6-year-olds in dark pantries that smell like onions. Your daughters ran away from her, Arthur. They ran through the rain and came into a shop and begged a stranger to pretend to be their father because they were terrified of her." He heard a sharp intake of breath on the other end, a gasp that sounded like a drowning man breaking the surface. They are safe, Elias continued, his voice steadying, anchoring the man on the other end. They are eating lemon cake. But you need to come here, now, not your assistant. Not a driver. Arthur stammered. The CEO was gone. The father was waking up, stumbling in the dark. Is she there? The nanny? I sent her away, Elias said. But she be back. Or she's heading to your house to cover her tracks. You need to come get your children. I'm coming, Arthur said. The sound of movement, a chair scraping violently against the floor, footsteps running. I'm 5 minutes away. Don't let them move. Don't let them out of your sight. I won't, Elias said. And, sir? Yes? Thank you, the voice cracked. It was the sound of a heart breaking open. The line went dead. Elias put the phone down on the table. He looked at the girls. He's coming, Elias announced. The girls looked at each other. The relief was palpable, but so was the anxiety. The dad, they knew, was a distant figure, a man of closed doors and silence. Is he mad? Chloe asked, voicing the fear in the room. No, Elias said. He reached out and took a sip of his tea. He's scared. Just like you were. Dads get scared? Sophie asked. Elias looked at the empty chair where the ghost of his son sat. He thought about the nights he spent checking the locks, the panic when a fever spiked, the crushing, breathless terror of the hospital waiting room. He thought about the fear of forgetting a voice, a laugh, a smell. Yes, Sophie, Elias said softly. Dads get scared more than anyone else in the world. They just try not to show it. They waited. The rain lashed against the window, blurring the world outside into streaks of gray and silver. The shop hummed around them. But inside the booth, in the small, warm circle of yellow raincoats and empty cake plates, Elias felt a strange sensation. He wasn't heavy anymore. The waterlogged feeling in his lungs had drained away. He felt solid. He felt useful. He sat guard over the 3 girls, watching the door, ready to be the father they needed until the real one showed up to take the job back. And for the first time in 2 years, the empty chair across from him didn't look like a hole in the world. It just looked like a chair waiting for someone to sit in it. The phone sat on the table between them, a black monolith that had just transmitted a lifeline. The screen went dark, reflecting the distorted faces of 3 little girls and one man who was slowly waking up from a long, gray hibernation. 5 minutes, Elias said. He looked at the girls. He said 5 minutes. The shop had settled back into its library quiet rhythm. Though the energy in the back booth remained distinct, a hum of static electricity. The rain outside had intensified, drumming against the glass in a chaotic rhythm, turning the streetlights into smeared watercolors of amber and red. He's going to be wet, Maya said matter-of-factly, staring out the window. He hates getting his suit wet. He says wool smells like a wet dog. He won't care about the suit, Elias said. He picked up his teaspoon, turning it over in his fingers. Not today. The next few minutes stretched out, elastic, intense. Elias knew this feeling. It was the waiting room feeling. The space between the event and the resolution where the mind races through every possible permutation of the future. He looked at the girls. They were vibrating again, the sugar rush warring with the anxiety of the impending arrival. He needed to distract them. He needed to be a father for exactly 4 more minutes. You know, Elias said, pitching his voice low to draw their attention away from the door. Leo, my son, he wanted to be a magician. Sophie looked away from the entrance, her eyes latching onto Elias. A real magician, with a hat. With a cape, Elias smiled. The memory didn't hurt this time. It felt warm, like opening an oven door. He was terrible at it. He tried to make a coin disappear once and just threw it across the room. But he had one trick he mastered. Elias picked up a paper napkin. He unfolded it, smoothed it out on the table, and began to twist it. His large, calloused hands moved with a muscle memory he hadn't accessed in years. Twist, fold, tuck. He wasn't looking at the napkin. He was looking at Chloe, whose leg was bouncing nervously under the table. He used to make roses, Elias said, for his mom. Whenever she was sad, he finished the twist and held it up. It was a crude paper rose, slightly lopsided, but recognizable. He tucked it behind Chloe's ear. There, Elias said. For bravery. Chloe reached up and touched the paper flower. She stopped bouncing. A small, shy smile broke through the tension on her face. Thank you. Can you teach me? Sophie asked, leaning in. Me too, Maya added. So, for the remaining 3 minutes, Elias ran a workshop on napkin origami. He showed them how to pinch the center, how to spiral the edges. He watched their small fingers struggle with the paper, correcting them gently, praising their efforts. For a moment, the tea shop wasn't a refuge from a storm or a hiding place from a monster. It was just a table where a dad was teaching kids how to make something beautiful out of something disposable. Then the door opened. It didn't jingle politely. It slammed against the stoop stop with a violence that made the barista jump. Arthur Pendergast stood in the frame. He was a man built for boardroom stall, broad-shouldered, wearing a navy suit that likely cost more than Elia's car. But right now, the boardroom was a million miles away. He was soaked. His hair was plastered to his skull, water dripping from his nose and chin. His tie was loosened, the top button of his shirt undone as if he had clawed at it for air. He wasn't wearing an overcoat. He stood there, chest heaving, his eyes wild, scanning the room. He looked manic. He looked terrified. He looked like a father. "Daddy!" Sophie cried out. The sound broke the paralysis. Arthur's head snapped toward the corner booth. He saw the yellow raincoats. The air left his lungs in a visible shudder. He didn't walk, he ran. He collided with a chair, knocking it aside without breaking stride, and fell to his knees beside the booth. The girls scrambled out. They didn't hesitate. Whatever distance had existed between them and their father, the walls built by grief and work and nannies evaporated in the face of his raw panic. He gathered them in. It was a chaotic tangle of arms and wet fabric. He buried his face in Sophie's neck, his hands clutching Maya and Chloe so tight his knuckles turned white. "I've got you," Arthur choked out. His voice was a ruin. "I've got you. I'm here." "You're wet," Chloe said, patting his soaked shoulder. "I don't care," Arthur sobbed. He was crying openly, unashamedly in the middle of the gilded teapot. "I don't care. I'm so sorry." "I didn't know." God, I didn't know. Elias sat in the booth, watching. He felt like an intruder now, a voyeur to a moment that was too intimate for strangers, but he couldn't look away. He felt a phantom weight in his own arms, the ghost of a hug he would never give again. But instead of the familiar crushing sorrow, he felt a strange sense of alignment. The universe, which had been broken for 2 years, had clicked one small gear back into place. Arthur pulled back, but he didn't let go. He kept his hands on them, touching their faces, checking them. He saw the chocolate on Chloe's lip. He saw the paper rose behind her ear. Then his eyes landed on Sophie's arm. The sleeve of her raincoat was still pushed up. He saw the bruises. The transformation in Arthur's face was terrifying. The sorrow vanished, replaced by a cold, deadly clarity. He reached out and touched the violet marks with a trembling finger. "Did she do this?" Arthur asked. His voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of a thunderclap. "Yes," Sophie said. "And the pantry?" Arthur asked, looking at Maya. "Yes," Maya whispered. Arthur closed his eyes. He took a deep, ragged breath. When he opened them, the grief-stricken widower was gone. The titan of industry was back, but he wasn't thinking about mergers. He was thinking about destruction. "She will never come near you again," Arthur swore. "I promise you, on your mother's life, I promise you." He stood up. He was shaky, his legs unsteady, but he drew himself up to his full height. He turned to the booth. He looked at Elias. For a long moment, the two men just stared at each other. They were mirrors. Both in their 40s, both scarred by loss, both trying to navigate a world that had lost its center. But one was wet and frantic, and the other was dry and still. "You?" Arthur said. He wiped a hand across his face, smearing the rain and tears. Elias stood up. He slid out of the booth, unfolding his tall frame. "Mr. Pendergast." Arthur looked at the table. He saw the empty teapot, the crumb-dusted plates, the twisted paper napkins. He saw the sanctuary Elias had built for his daughters. "You called me," Arthur said. "You stopped her." "They stopped her," Elias corrected gently. "They ran, that took guts." "I just gave them a chair." Arthur shook his head. "No, you did more than that." He looked at the girls, who were now clinging to his legs like barnacles. "You listened to them. I stopped listening a long time ago." It was a brutal admission. A confession of failure that only a parent could understand. Grief is loud, Elias said softly. It makes it hard to hear anything else. Arthur looked at Elias with sudden recognition. He saw the fraying cardigan, the solitary nature of the tea setting, the deep lines etched around Elias's eyes. You lost someone too? Arthur stated. It wasn't a question. My wife Sarah and my son Leo, Elias said. 2 years ago, Arthur flinched as if he had been slapped. He looked down at his 3 living, breathing daughters. He looked back at Elias, who had none. The realization of what could have happened, of the preciousness of what he had been neglecting, hit him with the force of a freight train. Arthur started, but his voice failed. He reached out a hand. Elias took it. The handshake wasn't formal, it was a grip. A transfer of energy. Arthur held on tight, as if Elias was an anchor in the storm. Thank you, Arthur said. There aren't words, but thank you. Take them home, Elias said. He released the hand. Dry them off, order pizza. Watch a movie. I will, Arthur nodded. I have to make a phone call. To the police and to the agency? Do it later, Elias advised. Tonight, just be there. Right, Arthur said. Right, he looked down at his girls. Okay, troops, let's go. The car is outside. I left it running in the loading zone. I'd probably have a ticket. Can we get pizza? Chloe asked, looking up. We can get anything you want, Arthur said. Pizza? Ice cream? A pony, anything. He ushered them toward the door. The girls moved with him, a tight, yellow-clad cluster revolving around their father. But at the door, Sophie stopped. She turned back. She let go of her father's hand and ran back to the table. She stopped in front of Elias. She didn't say anything. She just wrapped her arms around his waist and squeezed. It was a quick, fierce hug. Bye, Dad, she whispered, a secret joke between them. Elias felt his heart crack, but it was a good crack. The kind that lets light in. He patted the top of her wet head. Bye, Sophie, he said. Keep that header top left. She grinned, turned, and ran back to Arthur. Arthur gave Elias one last nod, a salute from one soldier to another, and pushed the door open. The bell chimed, a bright, hopeful sound. They stepped out into the rain, but this time Arthur wasn't striding ahead. He was herding them, his arms spread wide to shield them from the downpour, his expensive suit ruining in the weather, and he didn't care one bit. The door swung shut. The silence rushed back in to fill the vacuum. Elias was alone. He stood by the booth for a moment, listening to the fading sound of the car engine outside. The adrenaline that had sustained him for the last hour began to ebb, leaving him feeling heavy again. But it was a different kind of heavy. It wasn't the weight of water. It was the weight of muscle that had been used after a long atrophy. Good fatigue. Brenda walked over. She had a bus tub in her hands. She looked at the table, the carnage of tea and cake and napkins. Quite a party, she said softly. Elias looked at the mess. He looked at the empty chair opposite him. For 2 years, that chair had been a shrine. A do-not-touch zone. He had guarded it with a jealous ferocity, keeping it empty because his life felt empty. Now it was just a chair. It was slightly crooked. There were crumbs on the seat. A wet napkin was stuck to the backrest. It looked lived in. Do you want me to clear this, Elias? Brenda asked, hesitating. She knew the ritual. She knew he usually sat for another hour, staring at the empty space. Elias looked at the chair. He thought about Leo. He thought about the blueberry scone that Maya had eaten. He realized with a sudden, startling clarity that Leo wouldn't have wanted the scone to sit there and go stale. Leo would have wanted it eaten. He would have wanted the magic trick shown. He would have wanted the noise. Elias took a deep breath. The air in the shop smelled of bergamot and rain, but also of lemon cake and life. Yes, Elias said. His voice was clear. Clear it all away, Brenda. Brenda smiled, a genuine, crinkling smile. You got it, hon? She began to stack the plates. Clatter, clink. The noise didn't bother him. Elias reached for his wallet. He pulled out a $50 bill, far more than the cost of the tea and the cake. He placed it on the table. For the mess, he said. You don't have to. I want to, Elias said. He buttoned his cardigan. He felt the damp spot where Sophie had pressed against him. It was cold, but beneath it his skin felt warm. He walked to the front of the shop. He paused at the glass door, looking out. The rain was still falling, sheeting down in gray curtains. Seattle in February. It was relentless. But as he watched the water hit the pavement, washing the grime into the gutters, he didn't see it as a drowning force anymore. It was just water. It fell, it washed, it dried, it was part of the cycle. Elias pushed the door open. The bell chimed above him, a goodbye or perhaps a hello. He stepped out. The cold hit him instantly, biting at his exposed face. He turned his collar up. He didn't shrink from it, he lifted his head. He had a walk to make. He had a house that was too quiet, but he realized now that the silence wasn't a permanent condition, it was just a pause. He thought about the resume sitting on his laptop, untouched for 6 months. He thought about the guest room that was filled with boxes he hadn't unpacked. He thought about the phone number Arthur Pendergast had dialed from a connection to the living world. Elias took the first step onto the wet sidewalk. His boots splashed in a puddle. Clip, clop, he walked. He wasn't marching and he wasn't fleeing. He was just walking home. And for the first time in 730 days, Elias looked forward to tomorrow.